The chilling truth about Joseph Stalin. In the 20th century, one man ruled over a nation the size of a continent and left behind a trail of fear, famine, and death so massive that historians are still counting the bodies. His name was Joseph Stalin. He wasn't just a dictator, he was a man who turned paranoia into policy, who built an empire on forced labor, mass executions, and engineered starvation. Millions were exiled, tortured, or killed. He didn't just silence his enemies, he erased them from history. And yet, even today, statues of him still stand. Some still call him a hero. But the truth is far darker. Today we uncover the chilling legacy of Joseph Stalin. But before we dive into the terror he unleashed, we need to go back a few decades to the day he was born. Background and early life. Joseph Stalin was not born with power. He was born into hardship. On December 18, 1878, in the small town of Gori in what was then the Russian Empire and is now the country of Georgia, a child named Iosif Vissarionis Dezhugashvili entered the world. His family was poor and Georgian, and they spoke Georgian at home. Iosif would later adopt a Russian identity, but in his earliest years he was deeply shaped by the culture and struggles of his homeland. His father, Vissarion Dezhugashvili, was a shoemaker by trade. At one time, Vissarion had a stable job and income, but when his workshop failed, his life began to fall apart. He started drinking heavily and became violent. Iosif and his mother, Yekaterina, often suffered the consequences. She was a deeply religious woman who tried to protect her son from his father's outburst, and she took on work as a seamstress to support them. The family moved frequently, living in rented rooms, and sometimes even in homes of relatives or neighbors. Iosif also faced serious health problems. When he was just 6 years old, he contracted smallpox. The disease left his face badly scarred for the rest of his life. Other children mocked him, and he grew up isolated and bitter. When he was 12, he was hit by a horse-drawn carriage, which seriously injured his left arm. The damage was so severe that the arm never fully healed. It remained stiff and shorter than his right. This made some people see him as weak. But Iosif never forgot how to hide his pain. Despite his poor health and troubled family life, Iosif was a bright student. His mother had one hope for him, that he would become a priest. In 1894, thanks to his strong academic performance, he earned a scholarship to the Tiflis Theological Seminary, the top religious school in the region. At first he studied hard, but his interest in the Bible began to fade. He secretly started reading banned books, works by Karl Marx and other revolutionary thinkers. He began to question not just the church, but the entire political system of the Russian Empire. Instead of praying, he debated. Instead of obeying, he started organizing. It was around this time that he began to change not just his ideas, but also his identity. He dropped his birth name and began using aliases. The name that would stick was Stalin, which comes from the Russian word for steel. Before that, he had already taken the name Koba, after a hero from Georgian literature who fought against oppression. But Stalin was different. It sounded Russian, cold and strong, and literally meant man of steel. Rise to power. After leaving the seminary in 1899, Iosif fully stepped into the underground world of revolution. He joined the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, a group that aimed to overthrow the Tsar and replace the monarchy with socialism. His early work in the party was not glamorous. He helped organize strikes, printed illegal newspapers, and gave fiery speeches in secret meetings. He also became known for a darker talent, raising money through robbery. In 1907, Stalin helped plan one of the most notorious heists of the time, the armed robbery of a bank convoy in Tiflis. The attackers threw grenades and fired guns in broad daylight. Dozens were killed or wounded, but the robbers escaped with a huge sum of cash meant for the Tsar's treasury. The Bolsheviks, the radical faction of the party, used the money to fund their activities. This earned Stalin a reputation as a loyal soldier of the revolution, though many comrades viewed him as dangerous and crude. Stalin was arrested several times and spent years in exile in remote areas of Siberia. But every time he managed to escape and return to revolutionary work. He gained more influence when he became the editor of Pravda, the main Bolshevik newspaper. By now he had adopted the name Stalin and was moving quietly but steadily through the party ranks. In 1917, the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, seized power in the October Revolution. Stalin played a supporting role but remained close to the inner circle. He was loyal, quiet, and always useful. In 1922, Lenin rewarded that loyalty by appointing Stalin as General Secretary of the Communist Party. At the time, it seemed like a low-level job, mostly organizing party records and meetings. But Stalin used the position to build a network of allies and place loyal followers in key roles across the Soviet Union. As Lenin's health declined in the early 1920s, Stalin grew bolder. But not everyone trusted him. In 1923, Lenin dictated a private document known as his Testament. In it, Lenin warned the party that Stalin had become too powerful and suggested removing him from leadership. He wrote that Stalin was rude, harsh, and dangerous. But when Lenin died in 1924, party leaders kept the testament secret. They feared it would cause a split, and some of them, like Zinoviev and Kamenev, still hoped to control Stalin or use him against their rival Leon Trotsky. They were wrong. Stalin moved quickly and cleverly. He first isolated Trotsky, portraying him as too arrogant and too focused on global revolution instead of building socialism at home. By 1927, Trotsky was expelled from the party and later exiled from the Soviet Union. Next, Stalin turned against Zinoviev and Kamenev, accusing them of disloyalty and undermining party unity. Finally, he removed Nikolai Bukharin, who had supported the new economic policy, a system Stalin no longer believed in. By 1929, Stalin stood alone. The quiet, scar-faced man from Georgia had outmaneuvered all his opponents. He was now the uncontested ruler of the Soviet Union. But with absolute power came absolute control and absolute cruelty. The Holodomor. When Stalin finally took power in 1929, he believed the Soviet Union had to modernize quickly or be left behind by the industrial powers of the West. To achieve this, he launched an ambitious campaign to transform the countryside. His plan was called collectivization, and it meant that all private farms would be taken over by the state. Instead of growing their own land, animals, or tools, peasants would now work on large, government-run collective farms. Stalin claimed this would make farming more efficient and support industrial growth. But for the millions of peasants who lived off their land, it was a disaster. Many resisted, especially the more successful farmers known as kulaks. They were not rich landlords, but simply peasants who owned a bit more than others, maybe a few cows or extra acres of land. Stalin saw them as enemies of socialism. In what became known as dekulakization, these so-called kulaks were hunted down. Hundreds of thousands were arrested, deported to Siberia, or sent to forced labor camps. Many were shot. Their property was confiscated, their families torn apart. But the worst was yet to come. In 1932, Stalin ordered impossibly high grain quotas from Ukraine, one of the most fertile regions in the entire Soviet Union. Grain was taken from villagers by force, leaving almost nothing for the people who grew it. Soviet agents searched homes, seized food, and punished anyone who tried to hide even a handful of flour. To stop peasants from escaping or searching for food elsewhere, Stalin sealed Ukraine's borders. Trains and roads were blocked. Even gathering leftover crops in the fields, called gleaning, was criminalized and could lead to arrest or execution. What followed was one of the deadliest famines in human history. Between 1932 and 1933, millions of Ukrainians, men, women, and children, died from starvation. People ate grass, tree bark, and even stray animals. Entire villages were left empty. Eyewitnesses reported parents watching their children die, unable to do anything. Some resorted to unthinkable acts just to survive. Many historians now agree the famine was intentional. It was used to break Ukrainian resistance, destroy its national identity, and enforce absolute control. Stalin himself once said, "He who does not work shall not eat." To him, starving peasants were obstacles. As we move forward, we'll see that the Holodomor was not an isolated event. It was only the beginning of a broader terror campaign that would turn Stalin's paranoia into mass murder. The Gulag system. As Stalin tightened his grip on the Soviet Union, he built more than just factories and railroads. He built a system of fear, a network of labor camps that stretched across the most remote and unforgiving parts of the USSR. This system was called the Gulag, short for Main Administration of Camps, and it became one of the most terrifying tools of state power in the 20th century. At first, these camps were meant for common criminals, but under Stalin, the Gulag quickly expanded. It became a place not just for thieves and murderers, but for intellectuals, scientists, artists, priests, and even ordinary people who said the wrong word or were simply suspected of disloyalty. Anyone could be taken. No trial was needed. A careless joke, a letter to a friend, or being related to the wrong person could land you in a camp. From the early 1930s until Stalin's death in 1953, millions of people passed through the Gulag system. Some were there for weeks, others for decades. At least 1.5 million prisoners died, though some estimates suggest even higher numbers. The camps were often located in the coldest and harshest parts of the Soviet Union, like Siberia in the Arctic Circle. Prisoners worked long hours in freezing temperatures, building roads, mining, logging, or digging canals with bare hands. Starvation was common. Beatings, torture, and disease a part of everyday life. But it's important to understand that the Gulag wasn't just a punishment system. It was a tool of control. Stalin used it to crush dissent, erase opposition, and remind people that no one was safe. If you disobeyed or simply were unlucky, you vanished into the camps. One of the most tragic examples was Osip Mandelstam, a celebrated Russian poet. In 1933, he wrote a short poem that mocked Stalin, calling him a cruel mountain-dwelling ruler with fat fingers. And as you can guess, that was enough. Mandelstam was arrested, tortured, and sent to the camps. He died in transit in 1938, and his body was never recovered. The Great Purge. By the mid-1930s, Stalin's rule over the Soviet Union was absolute, but his fear of enemies, both real and imagined, had reached dangerous new heights. This fear exploded into a brutal campaign known as the Great Purge or the Great Terror. It was a time when no one was safe. It began with a series of show trials, public trials of former Communist Party leaders who had once stood by Lenin. Men like Grigory Zinoviev, Lev Kamenev, and Nikolai Bukharin were arrested, tortured, and forced to confess to crimes they never committed. The accusations were bizarre: sabotage, treason, plotting with foreign governments. The trials were staged for the cameras, but the outcomes were always the same: a forced confession followed by execution. Behind the scenes, Stalin used the secret police, the NKVD, to carry out the purges. Under the leadership of Nikolai Yezhov, the NKVD spread terror across the country. People were arrested in the middle of the night. Neighbors would hear the knock at the door and then never see that person again. Between 1936 and 1938, over 700,000 people were executed. That's nearly 1,000 killings per day, every day for 2 years. Millions more were arrested and sent to the already mentioned Gulag. The victims included army generals, teachers, engineers, doctors, and loyal Communist Party members. Stalin even had many of his own top officials eliminated, men who had helped him rise to power just a decade earlier. One of the most chilling aspects of this purge was Stalin's obsession with rewriting the past. As people were erased in real life, they were also erased from history. Official photographs were altered. Former allies like Yezhov, who led the purges, were literally cut out of photos once they fell out of favor. Stalin wanted to control not just the present, but the memory of the past. Cultural and ethnic cleansing. At the same time, Stalin was waging another kind of war, one not fought with tanks or guns, but with ideas, beliefs, and identities. He wasn't just trying to control people's actions. He wanted to control their thoughts, their faith, and even who they believed they were. This was a war on the soul. Religion had always been strong in Russia. For centuries, churches stood in nearly every village, and millions of people practiced their faith freely. But under Stalin, that changed. He saw religion as a threat to his authority, something that could compete with loyalty to the Communist Party. Churches were closed or demolished, priests were arrested, and religious holidays were banned. The Russian Orthodox Church suffered terribly, but so did Jews, Muslims, Buddhists, and Catholics. Faith had no place in Stalin's ideal Soviet citizen. But it didn't stop at religion. Stalin also wanted to reshape entire populations. During the 1930s and 1940s, he forcibly deported whole ethnic groups, accusing them of disloyalty or collaboration with enemies. Imagine waking up one day to find armed guards outside your home, forcing you and your family onto trains with just a few belongings. That's what happened to the Crimean Tatars, Chechens, Ingush, Balkars, Karachay, and the Volga Germans. These groups were packed into cattle cars and sent thousands of kilometers away, you guessed it, to Siberia or Central Asia. Many died from hunger, cold, or disease along the way. At the same time, Stalin encouraged pseudo-scientific ideas, like Usenkoism, which rejected real biology in favor of politically approved theories. This had terrible consequences for agriculture and food production. But perhaps the strangest and most disturbing idea came when Stalin reportedly supported a bizarre project to create ape-human hybrids, so-called invisible workers, who can endure pain and eat almost anything. Led by scientist Ilya Ivanov, this experiment failed, but it shows just how far Stalin was willing to go to engineer a new kind of society, one without religion, without ethnic identity, and without weakness. Things grew even darker in the late 1940s. After the founding of the State of Israel, Stalin grew suspicious of Soviet Jews, accusing them of having divided loyalties. Rumors began to spread that he was planning to deport the entire Jewish population to the Jewish Autonomous Region at Birodejan in Siberia. Then came the infamous doctors' plot. In 1952, a group of mostly Jewish doctors was accused of trying to poison Soviet leaders. They were arrested, tortured, and publicly shamed. Stalin's press launched open anti-Semitic campaigns targeting the so-called rootless cosmopolitans. Many feared that mass deportations were just around the corner. And perhaps they were, because just weeks after the arrest, Stalin suddenly fell ill. Imagine how it must have felt to be a Jew, a priest, a Chechen, or even a scientist in Stalin's Soviet Union. You never knew if tomorrow you'd be exiled, arrested, or simply erased. Stalin and World War II and beyond. Between 1940 and 1950, while the world was still shattered from the destruction of World War II, Stalin turned that chaos into an opportunity for control, for fear, and for punishment. Millions were dying across Europe from bombs and bullets, but inside the Soviet Union, terror came not only from the Nazis, but also from Stalin himself. And what makes this chapter of history even more chilling is how easily cruelty became official policy. When Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, Stalin was caught off guard. Despite repeated warnings from British and Soviet intelligence, he had refused to believe Hitler would break the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. As German tanks rolled across the border, the Red Army was disorganized, poorly led. Many of its top generals had been purged just years earlier, and completely unprepared. But instead of admitting his mistake, Stalin responded with brutal desperation. He issued Order Number 227, one of the most infamous military orders in modern history. It said simply, "Not one step back." Soldiers who panicked or retreated were to be executed on the spot. Thousands were shot by their own commanders or by blocking detachment units placed behind the front lines with orders to kill any Red Army troops who fled battle. Soldiers who disobeyed were thrown into penal battalions, forced to fight in the most dangerous situations with little chance of survival. Stalin believed fear was a more powerful weapon than any tank. And while his men died in droves on the front, Stalin had no mercy for civilians either. As German troops advanced, he ordered a scorched earth policy, burning homes, crops, and infrastructure to deny resources to the enemy, even if it meant starvation for his own people. In occupied territories, political prisoners were executed in mass killings to prevent them from falling into German hands. This was war without compassion. But that cruelty didn't stop with the enemy. As the Red Army pushed into Germany in 1944 and 1945, Soviet soldiers committed widespread rapes and looting, especially in Berlin and other German cities. Western reports and Soviet survivors both confirmed the horror. When Stalin heard about it, he didn't punish anyone. In fact, he reportedly said, "What is so awful in his having fun with a woman after such horrors?" For Stalin, victory erased all sins. Now imagine surviving the war only to return home in chains. For Soviet prisoners of war, that was reality. Stalin believed that any soldier who surrendered was a traitor. In his mind, real Soviet men would rather die than be captured. His chilling statement said it all. There are no prisoners of war, only traitors to the motherland. When the war ended in 1945, tens of thousands of Soviet POWs were interrogated, imprisoned, or executed. Many were sent directly from Nazi camps to the Soviet Gulag system. These were men who had survived unimaginable horrors in German captivity, only to face more torment at home. And even after the war ended, Stalin's paranoia didn't fade. It got worse. He trusted no one. Returning soldiers were seen as contaminated by the West. Political purges began again. Ethnic groups like the Chechens and Crimean Tatars, who had already suffered deportation, remained in exile. His tyranny didn't end with Hitler's defeat. It only found new targets. At this point of the story, it's hard not to wonder what kind of leader sees every returning hero as a potential enemy. What kind of ruler responds to invasion with bullets aimed at his own men? And yet, Stalin still ruled with absolute power. But even the strongest tyrants don't live forever. Stalin's final years. By the early 1950s, Joseph Stalin was no longer the revolutionary firebrand of his youth. He was an aging dictator, nearly 75 years old, and his health had begun to fail. He spent more and more time in his dacha outside Moscow, surrounded not by friends or family, but by terrified guards and subordinates who feared his unpredictable mood swings. After decades of purges, betrayals, and executions, few dared to speak freely around him. Even doctors were afraid to tell him the truth about his condition. What makes his final days so disturbing is how they reflected the very system he had created. One ruled by fear, silence, and absolute obedience. On the night of March 1, 1953, Stalin was found lying on the floor of his private quarters in the Kuntseva dacha, semi-conscious, unable to speak or move. For hours, yes hours, no one dared to enter the room. His guards had been trained to never disturb him without direct orders, and disobeying that rule could mean execution. Imagine the fear, the most powerful man in the country lying helpless, while those just outside the door stood frozen, afraid to help. When officials were finally called, it was already too late. Stalin had suffered a massive stroke, likely caused by severe hypertension and long-term arteriosclerosis, hardening of the arteries. But for the next few days, his entourage kept up appearances, spoon-feeding him, administering injections, and hoping for a miracle. Stalin remained mostly unresponsive. On March 5, 1953, he died. But here's where things get strange. Almost immediately, theories of poisoning began to circulate. Some believe Stalin had been deliberately left untreated by his inner circle, especially Lavrentiy Beria, the notorious secret police chief who may have wanted him out of the way. Others even suggested that Stalin was directly poisoned, though there was no conclusive evidence of this. Still, the idea that Stalin, the man who distrusted everyone, might have finally fallen victim to his own system, is hard to ignore. It's a powerful image, isn't it? After years of ruling with absolute power, Stalin died alone, speechless, and surrounded by people too afraid to save him. What do you think? Was Stalin a necessary evil in shaping the Soviet Union, or one of history's most ruthless tyrants? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more hidden chapters of history they never taught us in school. See you in the next one.